You know, we've talked about the tools that you need to successfully get out of debt. We've talked about creating a debt inventory, talked about credit monitoring, accountability partner, goals and rewards. And I've also gone through on the course so far a general description or a teaching course on the boundary planning system. And I got to tell you that this is the most important tool that you've got to master. You've got to be able to master your spending and being able to effectively manage that. Now, for most people, this is a problem. They don't know how to manage their spending. I would say the vast majority of people don't know how to do this. So this is something that you got to learn. I got to tell you that it's a process. It's a process of learning. It's a process of developing the habit. But this will serve you well because of the fact that we've got to stop increasing the debt and start decreasing the debt. And what ends up happening, I find, is that people try to get out of debt, and they go along and they get to the end of the month and there is more spending than there is income that's coming in. And so because of that, when that happens, when there's an excess of spending, it goes on the credit card. It's the first place it goes. If you don't have the income, it goes on the credit card. So we've got to eliminate that process. We've got to get you to where you're spending within your means. And the other thing too that's real key about managing your spending is that we've got to figure out how to create money to pay off extra debt beyond the minimum payment. So I thought to myself, what's the best way to do this? And to me, the best way is practical application. Now, this spreadsheet that you see behind me here is a smaller version of a big spreadsheet that we've developed that you can use to create the boundary system for yourself. And this is what I want you to do. Since you've bought the program, I want you to go to bob@prudentmoney.com or go to prudentmoney.com, and there's an Ask Bob section, and fill out the form and say, hey Bob, I'm in the middle of the program at Prudent Money University. Please send me the spreadsheet. I will send it to you. Okay, I really want you to be successful in getting out of debt, and this is such a key element in making that happen. So let's take a look at it, and listen, I want to make sure that for those of you who might be intimidated by numbers, I know not everybody is number oriented, but don't be intimidated by this because it's just plugging in numbers. You're plugging in your spending, you're tracking your spending, and once you master this, this is going to be a great benefit to you overall during the time when you're trying to get out of debt, and then when you're debt free. It'll be amazing what you can do with this. So let's start and talk about this. As you're looking at the screen, you'll see column A right here. Now this is simply and by the way, if you have not yet gone through the course, you should have already gone through the course, but if you haven't gone through the course on boundary planning, you got to do that before we talk about this. But just column A is the boundary accounts. And a boundary account is everything that you spend money on. Now, with the boundary accounts, anything that's over $5 needs to be tracked. It's my $5 rule. Anything underneath $5 doesn't need to be tracked. And you're going to have two types of expenses here. The two types of expenses are fixed expenses and variable expenses. So you see here, mortgage and rent, that's a fixed expense. So if you were starting out today and it was May, what you would do is you would fill in $1,000 across the board all the way through December. We do this a year at a time. And then you start to look at things like electricity. That's a variable expense. It's not constant day in and day out. Month in and month out. So you would figure out what's the average expense. And obviously you want to boost that a little bit during the summer months and so that you're capturing exactly what you think you're going to spend. And then we'll have expenses over here that don't even come, that you'll do nothing with that boundary account for May. So for instance, school costs, that's something that always sneaks up on me in August. And it seems like we spend so much money getting the kids back to school, and I never plan for it because I always don't think about it. So in order to prevent that from not happening, forgetting about it, you would go all the way over here to August, and you would plug into that boundary account. That's what you're going to spend, and so that you'll know about it. What this does, once you put all your normal expenses and you populate these boundary accounts, and you have it all populated out, and then you add in, another good one would be like your auto repair. Let's say that you know that you're going to have to get new tires, and you look at it and go, I think I got a couple of months left on these tires. So you go out a couple of months and go, okay, I'm going to plug in. It's going to cost me about $600, and I'm going to put that in the auto repair. What that does is that gives you a visual. Now, you may be looking a couple of months down the road and go, wow, I've got this amount of income coming in, but I've got this amount of expenses. This is when we go to work, because you're doing one of the core principles of boundary planning, which is anticipation of expenses and planning for those so it doesn't catch you off guard. Because remember, once again, if it doesn't get paid for with income, it gets paid for on the credit card. We don't want to increase the credit card. We want to do without that. We want to eliminate the credit card debt. So let's take a look at some of these numbers. Now, I've gone in and I have plugged in expenses, and let's take a look, say, at electricity. You had in your boundary account $300, and you actually spent $250, so it gives you a $50 positive in the electricity boundary account. Let's go down here, and you spent for the babysitter, you allocated $100. You spent $125. Now you have a $25 deficit in that babysitter boundary account. So you look at the two. You got $50 up here positive, $25 negative. So what you do, let me adjust this for you. You have to bear with me here real quick. What you do is you go over here to the electricity account where you had $300, but you changed that to $250. Now you move that 50 down. You changed that to not 50. You're over. You changed that to $275, and that leaves you $25 left over there. And you switch that 25 down here to babysitter. You increase this by 125. That gets rid of the deficit. Now, does that make sense? Let me talk through that now. What you did, you really just spent on electricity $275. You had $300 allocated in the boundary account. So you want to move $25 from here all the way down to here. So you subtract out $25 and you remove it. So that makes this $25 of the 50, and you take the $25 down here to the babysitter, you add it in, and that gives you a zeroed out ending amount. So the key is that through the month you're tracking your overages, and you're tracking where you've gone, where you went under your boundary account for the month. That way you can tell if you're on track to finish the month with a positive number or at least an equal number. You don't want to finish the month with a deficit. And incidentally, when we're talking about this, in May, all I want to see is May expenses. I don't want to see June expenses. And by the time I get to the end of May, I want to have closed out all May expenses and paid all of May expenses, so we can start afresh with June. Now, this is what you do with your income. How do you know what income to use for May? Typically, people are paid 2 times a month. So at the end of April, you get the April 30th paycheck, and then you get the May 15th paycheck. Those 2 paychecks are going to go to fund these expenses during the month of May. And then when you go to June, you're going to use May 30th paycheck and June 15th paycheck as the money to fund these expenses in June. But once again, if you've populated this out, if you've anticipated exactly what you're going to be spending, you're going to know where, hey, I've got this amount of income, but I've got this amount of expenses. Where am I going to find the additional money? Now, fortunately, I have built into the system contingency plans, which we're going to talk about. So let's go down here and look at a couple of other boundary accounts that you can take advantage of. And I come down to allowance. Now, I'm a big believer, if you can afford it inside your spending plan, I'm a big believer that you allow for an allowance for you and your spouse. I think it's important to have money that's not tracked, money that you can spend on whatever you want to, and there's no rules, no regulations, or anything on that money. And the way to implement this is simply this. In an ideal situation, you were able to pay out money as far as allowance goes. So you start out your boundary plan, and you wait till the end of the month to pay out the money, because you want to know, maybe I need it to pay other expenses. So if you get to the end of the month, then you pay out the money because you know you have it, as opposed to paying out the money at the beginning of the month that gets spent, and then you go, oh no, we needed that money for something else. So the allowance is something that I think works out really well if you can afford to do it. And then as we go down, you'll see right here, gifts, holidays, and birthdays, and then savings for gifts. Now this is an important category because, think of it right now. How many of you have actually planned for Christmas? We spend a lot of money during Christmas and it's rarely planned for. People rarely sit there in January and go, okay, we're going to spend maybe $1,500 at Christmas and I'm going to start saving for it. So what you want to do is when you start this out, you want to figure, how much do I need to save for Christmas? How much do I need to save for birthdays? And start saving that money. Now, each month you want to take that money out of your bank account and put it in a savings account. Which brings me to, how do you manage the savings account? So let's go over here to the second sheet, and this comes with it, with the spreadsheet. In this savings account, I have $7,000, and I'm going to explain what all this means here in a minute. I have general savings, vacation fund, gifts, and American Express. So basically what I would do, if let's say that I had $800 in gifts and I put $200 in it, then I would raise it to $1,000. So I know that I see $7,000 inside of my savings account, but this keeps it allocated and this keeps it straight as to what makes up that $7,000. As you can tell, there's quite a bit of detail in this. But here's what I want to explain to you, though, is that as you do this, as you develop the habit of sitting down each week, pulling your expenses, putting them on this sheet, you start to get better and better at it. You start to getting to where this flows pretty quick, the process, and it doesn't take as much time. I will warn you, though, it can be frustrating if you're not used to doing this. And so you've just got to accept that and realize the goal is to get an effective spending strategy and plan to where you can manage your spending, because this is going to make or break you as far as getting out of debt. Now, we've talked about saving for gifts and figuring that out ahead of time. And this is what I think people do. I think that for most people, Christmas is a good example of this. I think they kind of ignore it. They know they're going to have to spend money, but it's kind of one of these things where I really don't want to save for it, so I'm going to figure it out later. You don't want to be figuring out anything later. You want to plan and anticipate, because if you are left to figure it out later, guess what ends up happening? You create debt. We want to eliminate debt. Remember, that's why we're doing the programs. We want to eliminate debt, not create debt. And this gets you real with your spending. I have this phrase called fantasy budgeting. You just spend money and hope money's there at the end of the month. We don't want to do that anymore. We want to get real with our spending of what we have. And I'll tell you that if, typically in a marriage, one spouse takes care of the bills, would take care of this process, and the other doesn't. And what ends up happening is that spouse that's not involved kind of gets out of sync with what's going on, and nobody talks and nobody communicates. That's why in the boundary planning system I talk about, it's important that you set a time each month that you sit down, you look at the spending, and then together you anticipate. Because I know with my wife, she's seeing costs and expenses that I don't even know that are there. And then she's already anticipating. So we get together and we communicate, and it's all about managing and the resources you have effectively and making sure that you're not overspending. Because once again, what does overspending do? It creates debt. Now, let's talk about the spending tool for just a second. Everybody has a spending tool. Unfortunately, for most people, it's a debit card. I'm not a real big believer and big advocate of debit cards. I'll tell you why here in a minute. But most people, it's a debit card, and that comes directly out of the bank account. And really, from this standpoint, it's probably I'm going to contradict myself, but it's probably the better way. The reason I don't like debit cards is simply this. From an identity theft standpoint, you're giving a thief direct entree into your bank account, which you don't want to do. I would rather give them, access to a credit limit that I can get replaced versus a bank account where I might cause me problems if they stole money out of my bank account. That's the first thing. The second thing is you're not doing anything for your credit score with a debit card. You get no positive activity from using a debit card as you do a credit card. So those are the two things that I don't really care for debit cards. But really for this, you're getting the money taking out of the bank account. Now, how you use a credit card. Now, I use American Express because of the fact that American Express doesn't carry a balance, so I don't ever have to worry about being tempted to roll something over. They actually have a program, but it's very cumbersome to use. But for the most part, they expect you to pay it off and pay down and pay that in full each month. So that's what I like about the American Express card. So let's think of it this way: debit card, American Express, or a Visa MasterCard. Now, when I say Visa MasterCard, that could be a Visa MasterCard that has no balance on it or has balance, and I'm going to address both of them. But let's go back to the American Express cards. I think that's the easiest one, and you can use the Visa just like the American Express card because you're paying it off each month. Let's say we pull up our American Express, and we have, let's keep this very, very basic. Let's say that we pulled up our American Express, and we spent money on, let's say we spent money on groceries, and we spent $4.75, and so we put $4.75 in there. Now we have $25 left, and then we spent $2.50 on eating out, and we have that zeroed out. Okay, so we just spent money on two categories. They added up, and once again, it was eating out $2.50 and groceries of $4.75. So that comes out to $7.25. Let me make sure my math's right. Yes, that comes out to $7.25 that you've spent. Now, here's the thing to remember. Once you've swiped that card, you have spent that money. Don't kid yourself otherwise. You have spent that money. So it's important that as you do your weekly meeting, that you look on your credit card statement and go, okay, for this period of time, this is what I spent. This goes on my boundary planning spreadsheet. I fill in and I populate what I spent. And then it's important to say, okay, I spent $7.25. Now I need to remove $7.25 out of my bank account and into my savings account. Now, if you go through this process, what ends up happening is by the time the bill's due, it's already out of your bank account and it's ready to be paid. So now, American Express, you've just increased it by $7.50. So let's say it's $1,000, and that money is sitting in your savings account. It's a great way to manage your credit card and manage your spending and still have the convenience and some of the benefits of using credit to bolster your credit score. Now let's go back to the spreadsheet for real quick. Under Other, that's where you would have the American Express, and what I would do with American Express is keep tabs on your bill so you can fill that in, what the balance of it. But then I have overage and unexpected. And this is where I would encourage you to be able to put an amount that in case you did go over and you didn't have any positive boundary accounts, you can pull money from this boundary account to replace money that you overspent. And we would go through that exact same process that I talked about in the previous example, where you would deduct the money from the overage account, and then you would go and you would increase the boundary account by that same amount of money so that the spending equals out and now it's zero and you haven't overspent. Because here's the thing, sometimes you're going to set these boundary accounts and you're going to be wrong. You're going to put a lower number than it needed to be, so you're just adjusting that number up to what it should have been in the first place, and you're making it whole by using that overage boundary account. I also would encourage you to have a little bit of money that you save that goes into an emergency account. And let's say in this example, I have $200 that I'm saving each month. Now, when I'm saving that money, once again, it goes over into the savings account. Then I go to my savings spreadsheet and I increase it by $200 so I know that's how much money I have in savings. So what you're doing, you're creating the ultimate savings account to where if you had something unexpected happen, you had to spend $1,000 on your car to get it fixed, or you had something go out that needed to be fixed, a major repair in the home, whatever it is, now you can pull from savings, the overage account, you could even pull from the allowance account. So there's a lot of different areas that you can compensate yourself for and make sure that you're not doing what we've talked about throughout this entire course, creating debt. And so if you go through this process, and really, the thing is, you're going to have to, in order to create the overage account, to create the savings element of your spending, you're going to maybe have to cut back in other areas. I wouldn't look at that as a negative, because once you start getting financially confident, it's a great feeling. You reduce the stress, and you can do that through effectively managing your spending. As I said, at first, as you start out the process, it could be a little bit challenging, but you've got to look at the reward. You've got to look at the benefit of using a system like this so that you can get to the end of the month and you don't have that stress. I mean, I think that's the goal. And it also, a couple other things it does for you. It gets you and your spouse on the same page, which is really a great place to be financially. But it also makes you sit down and prioritizing. You look at that, you set back, say, $300 for eating out. And you go, you know what, that's not as important to me as building up a savings account. So we're going to eat out less. Or we're not going to eat out for 2 months. Whatever it is that you look at it, and that's the whole basis of the boundary planning system, is to spend based on your values. And collectively as a family, what are our values? And you might even find that, hey, boy, getting out of debt is our number one value. So you orientate everything towards getting out of debt, or building up a savings account, or whatever it might be, or your values might shift from month to month. But this allows you to get priority on your spending and get out of debt once and for all.